I tend to have a love-hate relationship with 80s King movies. Sometimes I enjoy them for admittedly biased, nostalgic reasons. Other times I dislike them for being virtually unrecognizable from the original story, or because they just didn't translate well to the big screen for any number of reasons. And this is the most common issue I have with 80s King movies. Sometimes they are just obvious products of their era that simply didn't age well. And while I wouldn't say I hated Silver Bullet, it is, much like myself, a very obvious product of the 80s. And while I'd like to think I'm holding up pretty well 4 decades later, I'm not sure the same could be said about Silver Bullet. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. I just worked a 12-hour day, and the last 2 days of my life were spent dealing with a backed-up septic sewage situation. I won't get into detail, but let's just say I have never been covered in so much human waste in my life. So I'm exhausted and will be doing minimal editing for this video. My apologies. Well, thank you for checking out this video. If you're into Stephen King horror novels, scary movies, and amateurish video editing, then please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. This is the second and final video in the Cycle of the Werewolf series. Last week's video was for the April 1985 illustrated novella, Cycle of the Werewolf. And today I'll be taking a look at the feature-length film adaptation, which was released in October of the same year and was entitled Silver Bullet. Silver Bullet isn't the worst 80s King movie. As of right now, I'd have to give that title to Children of the Corn or maybe The Running Man. But Silver Bullet, while definitely suffering from all of my least favorite 80s tropes to one extent or another, suffers more from a poorly written screenplay than anything else. History and background. As I discussed in my last video, Cycle of the Werewolf was originally intended to be presented in a calendar format, with each month featuring an illustration and a short vignette. In the foreword to this Silver Bullet edition of Cycle of the Werewolf, which includes both the original illustrated novella as well as the screenplay for and photos from the set of Silver Bullet, King discusses how he was approached by a man named Chris Savisa at the World Fantasy Convention in 1979 about the calendar project. King felt moved to write more than the format allowed, and once he realized he couldn't limit himself to 500 words per month, he went back to Savisa and broke the news. But Savisa, much to King's surprise, was delighted by the illustrated novella idea. Once the novella had been released, King sent a copy to regular King film producer Dino De Laurentiis, and it was Dino De Laurentiis who would go on to buy the rights and produce the film. It was also De Laurentiis who would convince King, against his better judgment, to write the screenplay. King admits that the various films of his work which Dino had produced weren't always artistic triumphs, but he liked Dino, and, well, the money sure didn't hurt. Director Dan Attias was brought in on the project, and Silver Bullet was his feature-length film directorial debut. Dino must have seen something in Attias when he took this leap of faith, and while the resulting film wasn't the strongest of directorial debuts, Attias has gone on to direct for some of the biggest TV shows of all time, including The Sopranos, Lost, House, The Walking Dead, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The cast included Corey Haim, who is best known for his role in The Lost Boys, Everett McGill, who some may remember for his role in Twin Peaks and his over-the-top performance in The People Under the Stairs, and Gary Busey, who is most well known for being a batshit crazy person. Now, I tried hard to dig deep and think of some greater message or moral lesson, just any takeaway from Silver Bullet, and I'm afraid I was unsuccessful in doing that. So rather than impart some meaningful interpretation or attempt to derive significance from this movie, I'm going to uselessly complain about it for a few minutes and explain why I just wasn't feeling this supposed cult classic. Man baby complains about movie no one cares about like a big dumb baby man. First and foremost, this screenplay is awful, which, and it pains me to say this, isn't surprising since it was Stephen King who wrote it. King screenplays are notoriously reliably bad. Some examples include Cat's Eye, Maximum Overdrive, Sleepwalkers, Golden Years, Rose Red, and Cell, none of which can reasonably be considered well-loved or fondly remembered. That's not to say King has never written a screenplay for a beloved adaptation of his work, though. The 1994 miniseries For the Stand is a fan favorite, and the original Pet Sematary was influential to some extent, and yeah, I guess that's it. Those are arguably the only good screenplays King ever wrote. And yeah, Silver Bullet isn't one of King's standout screenplays. To be clear, King's novels and his screenplays are different animals. Obviously, I'm a fan of the vast majority of King books, but as far as his screen adaptations go, and the following statement is not necessarily exclusive to King's screenplays, let's just say I'm a much bigger fan of the books than the movies in almost every instance, but particularly when King is writing his own screenplays. There are some inconsistencies in Silver Bullet that I was willing to overlook until the thing that was bothering me the most was brought up directly in the movie. In Cycle of the Werewolf, the story is told over the course of a year, with the full moon each month bringing the wrath of the werewolf along with it. But in Silver Bullet, the events take place over the course of maybe a week or two. The issue being a full moon doesn't last for a full week or two. At best, the moon can appear full for maybe 3 days, but the moon is only actually full for one night a month. I was willing to let this detail go since no one at any point had mentioned the moon or the, cycle of the moon until it does come up, and then the timeline of events just makes no sense whatsoever. Apparently, in the town of Tarker's Mills, a full moon just lasts as long as the plot requires it to. They eventually, toward the end of the movie, and as if to explain this issue away, they theorize that the closer they get to the full moon, the more complete the werewolf's transformation becomes, but, we've seen the werewolf multiple times by this point in the movie, and he is 100% an entire ass werewolf, fully formed, complete werewolf. So yeah, no, it's too late to try to explain this problem away. Honestly, this wouldn't be such a noticeable issue were it not the entire premise of the story the movie is based on. Also, Corey Haim is all like, what if it's not a man and it's a monster, like a werewolf? When at this point in the movie, he has no reason at all to even theorize about the killer being anything other than a human. He has not seen anything that would indicate a monster, or specifically a werewolf, not a paw print, not a shape lurking in the trees. He doesn't see any of the dismembered bodies and deduce that there are teeth marks or claw marks or anything. Nothing. He hasn't heard so much as a howl in the distance. He just comes to the conclusion there might be a werewolf based on literally nothing other than a few people are dead. So yeah, again, King wrote this into the screenplay in order to move the plot forward, and it's just silly. Oh, and apparently Corey Haim has incredible upper body strength and is able to climb in and out of his second-story window without the use of his legs. I mean, okay, sure, why not? On a good note, the motorcycle wheelchair that lovable drunk Uncle Gary Busey builds, which is emblazoned with the Silver Bullet moniker, is the ultimate badass machine. It looks like so much fun, and Corey Haim is very clearly driving that sucker himself, and he's tearing it up, just cruising around and ripping dank nooners. That's obnoxious motorcycle slang for popping wheelies, but the music for this scene, and only this scene, is absolutely horrible. Prior to this scene, which is right around the halfway point of the movie, the soundtrack predominantly consists of spooky, vibe-inducing string arrangements and live instrumentation, but when it strays away from the grandiose orchestral passages for the Silver Bullet motorcycle wheelchair reveal, it goes hard in the complete opposite direction with just the cheesiest of cheeseball 80s MIDI pop synth ass trash. And the end credit song is just about the worst fucking uplifting 80s power ballad I've ever heard. Just some next level hyper cringy synth pop with cheese just pouring out of every crevice. There are more issues, but I suppose those were the most apparent ones, and also I'm tired, so I'm done. Final thoughts. I know I complain a lot about movies from the 80s and music from the 80s and just the decade of the 80s in general, and I apologize if it's old hat for anyone who's been watching my videos for any length of time, but I just have such a hard time enjoying a lot of the popular and not so popular entertainment of that era. It was an awkward time for technology, both in the film and music industries. But I am willing to acknowledge that the 80s had to walk so the 90s could run. Also, I'm willing to admit that the 90s has a nostalgic sheen to it for me, and also was by no means free of bad music and movies. That most of the night shift movies that came out, and then all of the night shift movies from the 90s, yeah, they're bad. Also, I'm not a writer. I mean, who am I to criticize and critique Stephen King's screenplays? Like, even if I don't love everything the man has ever churned out, for every screenplay I don't like, there are dozens upon dozens of short stories, novels, and great movies he is responsible for, so the occasional blunder is entirely excusable. Next week, I'll be ranking all of the stories from the Skeleton Crew collection of short stories, which was King's second collection of short stories, and unlike Night Shift, Skeleton Crew inspired almost nothing in the way of screen adaptations. That's honestly shocking considering the number of bad movies Night Shift inspired. New videos drop every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so click that subscriber bell to get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.